Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have, Miller says he and Trump will use law enforcement to dismantle the left after Kirk shooting from commondreams.org, posted by Donald Key. And yeah, personally, I think this is just more gusto from Trump and his team. They always say, oh, we're going to completely dismantle the left. But ultimately, it's just kind of it's like what a lot of things is these days. It's just talk. It's all talk, no action. That's kind of a lot of what politics is these days. All talk, no action. People are always gonna say, "Oh, we're gonna destroy the other side and all that and get all our agenda done." But ultimately, it seems like that's not whatever really happens. Outside of maybe there's some action sometimes, like when Charlie Kirk gets assassinated. But most of the time, it's mostly just all talk, no action, and I think this is another example of that. Next, we have says the Trumpers who claim they are all more peaceful than leftists, but who were all over social media last week justifying the murders of those 11 people on the boat without due process by the shitbag Trump. Posted by Historical Donut 6758, and that looks like a post from Occupy Democrats Logic, and that looks like they put a picture of something. Then they posted a picture of something. They said in parentheses GC, and then they posted a picture of another guy's tweet. It says, I know some of you want to do the kumbaya thing. You want to say that the celebration of Charlie's death is only happening on the fringes. I'm sorry, but that's just not true. They jeered and heckled him in Congress yesterday. The left wants us dead. That is the mainstream view. It just is. It's the truth. They couldn't be any clearer about it. Stop lying to yourself. Face the facts. And yeah, personally, I think in Congress they did have the moment of silence for Charlie Kirk, but then the Republicans wanted to have a prayer as well, and then the Democrats started cheering. But regardless, the issue is, right now I think the big problem is people just simply have different values, and it can be hard to have unity with people who have different values than you, and yeah, my thoughts on that are, ultimately, if people do want to have unity with those who have separate values to be able to, but they shouldn't be forced to have unity if they don't want to. And that's my thoughts there, I think the best way to get out of this right now is we gotta probably, I think national divorce is probably the most sustainable way, let everyone have their own country, because, as long as there's a centralized country forcing its agenda down everyone's throats, so you can't really have any permanent unity or peace under that, because ultimately, as long as there's an authority enforcing laws, those laws are going to be biased to their beliefs as somewhat, and that's at least somewhat, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have new fault policing. Bill may let Rubio strip passports from U.S. citizens over political speech. Marco Rubio has claimed the power to designate people terrorist supporters based solely on what they think and say, said one free speech advocate, posted from commondreams.org, posted by Donald Key. And yeah, personally, I don't think that's very good. I think people should have free speech to say whatever they want without fear of getting their passports or other government documents revoked. But with that being said, the progressives have been on and on about, oh, we need to ban all hate speech misinformation for years. And that's just going to show you, neither side really supports free speech. The progressives will say, oh, I support free speech, but not hate speech misinformation. And the conservatives will say, oh, I support free speech, but not anti-Semitism. And that just goes to show you, there'll always be caveats when it comes to freedom of speech for a lot of people. And yeah, I personally think, I don't really care for Reddit and its circle jerking about how great Charlie Kirk's death is, or, saying, oh, I don't really care while secretly celebrating it. It seems to be the two major responses on Reddit. They say, oh, either I don't care, or, it's the greatest thing ever. And, I personally think, if the government would probably be more than justified banning Reddit at this point. But, I think the free speech perspective is, Reddit might be a cesspool full of nothing but progressive Marxist scumbags. But, that doesn't mean it should be censored. We need freedom of, as Noam Chomsky continues to say, if you don't believe for freedom of speech for those you despise, you don't believe in it at all, and that's very much the libertarian perspective. We need maximum freedom of speech, and that includes free speech for things that we personally disagree with. With that being said, you see a lot of push to cancel people for celebrating Charlie Kirk's death, and I think that's I guess, that could fall under freedom of speech as well. I'm personally kind of tired of cancel culture, but, ultimately, employers should have freedom of association to fire their employees for whatever reasons they feel like, and that includes having a bad take on social media. For years, the left was completely fine with cancel culture when it went against the right, but now it's suddenly being used against them, and then suddenly it's the worst thing ever. And that just goes to show you they don't have any principles, only teams, just like pretty much everyone in regards to U.S. politics these days, with the exception of only a few people, probably like myself. Then we have What an Idiotic Page, and that's another post from the Occupy Democrats Logic page, and that was them put a picture. They shared a picture of a tweet from Murray Hill guy who said the modern left is basically four groups: one, boomers who watch cable TV all day; two, minorities obsessed with quote unquote free stuff; three, woman who went crazy off birth control and SSRIs; four, mentally ill gender goblins. And yeah, I guess I would kind of agree with that. The left at this point, it's pretty much all revolves around wokeness. My parents were personally more on the first group. They'll believe whatever the TV tells them. They don't think for themselves. And you do have a lot of minorities with Democrat for all the stuff that the Democrats give them. And I guess, the average Redditor would probably be more in category 3 or 4, but I personally think you could probably add average Redditor as a fifth category here. Ultimately, the modern left is very much, they don't tolerate any dissent at all. The modern right kind of has a problem with dissent as well, but not nearly to the extent of the modern left. If you do any wrong thing on Reddit, you're going to get downvoted, and your post or comment will probably be removed. And that just goes to show you how increasingly, the left is supposed to be the side of they'll mark themselves as these free-thinking individuals, but a lot of the modern left are some of the most closed-minded people I've ever seen, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have this theoretical physicist from Eastern Kentucky and presumed political progressive talks about Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged from around 2517 into 43 video until about 29. And that's a post from DMBFFF, and that's a YouTube video from Angela Coiler, it looks like. Billionaires want you to know that because they could have done physics. And yeah, ultimately, I do think a lot of billionaires are very self-aggrandizing about what they could and couldn't have done. But regardless, personally, of course the left hates billionaires, but, it's unless if they play for their team like George Soros or J.B. Pritzker, and that just goes to show you how people will if they'll want you they'll try and put you in the out group if they could, but if they can find a category to put you in the in group, like if you give enough money to their causes, it just goes to show you how they're not, a lot of people don't really have principles these days. They'll just side with whatever the narrative is. The narrative, the narrative might be billionaires bad, but J.B. Pritzker good, especially if he gets the Democratic nod in 2028 for the presidency. And that just goes to show you, their world. It's very a lot of people's worldviews are very contradictory these days, especially when it comes to the Reddit leftists. And I had another good comment on that on the No Filter News subreddit. And my response to the guy said, I have to give the right a little bit of credit. They know how to change the narrative better than any group I've ever come across. And then I said in response, people follow whatever the narrative is rather than think for themselves. It's the same reason that Reddit goes, Trump is Hitler, but we need to ban guns. Those things, that sounds kind of contradictory to me. If you think Trump is literally Adolf Hitler, or even worse than Hitler, so I see sometimes that people say that, you shouldn't want to ban guns, you should want to have guns to defend against his, fascist regime, but it's inherently contradictory. That's what narrative is for you. They'll believe whatever the narrative is, even if the narrative inherently contradicts something else they believe. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have House passes Boebert bill to punish BDS boycott of Israel. The House has passed a bill punishing politically motivated boycotts of Israel. Free speech have to lose that again, from post by CH4Locks. And that's a cross post from the Law subreddit. And that looks like a link to an article from The Intercept. Israel boycott BDS Boebert. In a first step toward a federal law punishing criticism of Israel, the House of Representatives on Wednesday passed a massive defense budget that would bar companies engaged in politically motivated boycotts of the country from Pentagon contracts. The bill would effectively ban contractors boycotting Israel from tapping most federal contract dollars, since more than half of the $55 billion the U.S. government spent on contracts last year followed the Defense Department. The latest legislative attempt to target the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel's human rights violations, or BDS, would still have to pass the Senate. The upper chamber is debating its own version of the budget bill on Thursday that does not include an anti-BDS provision. My thoughts on that are, ultimately I do think people should be able to boycott whatever businesses they want. But if that being said, if the government doesn't want to do business with them, which this is what it seems to be here, the government says, oh, if you're a Pentagon contractor, we don't want to do business with you, boycott Israel. And personally, I think the libertarian position is, do business with whoever you want to. The government, I personally do like a lot of the boycotts of Israel, even though one of my websites I set up uses Wix, which is an Israeli website. But personally, just boycott whatever you want. If you want to boycott Israel, that's fine. If you don't, that's fine. But you can't. The government, if they want to not contract out workers or companies that boycott Israel, that's ultimately their right to do so. Ultimately the government will justify whatever they feel like, since they have the legal monopoly on the use of force. And yes, that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Charlie Kirk wasn't a free speech hero and wasn't hosted good faith debates posted by Mundane Image 13, and that looks like a blue sky thread. As one user said, Charlie Kirk hagiography shows our society's empty worship of form. He held debates, so he was a free speech hero. Never mind that they were rigged events where he'd tempt unworried college kids to spar with him and then humiliate them with cheap rhetorical tricks and put the footage online. And then John Rogers replied, "This gets to something that is a former stand-up I recognize but couldn't name. A 31-year-old professional content creator baiting 19-year-old amateurs into the format of his choice isn't debate, it's crowd work. It's debate-shaped crowd work farmed for content." And then the OP added, "I hear so often that Kirk wasn't just exercising his free speech rights and hosting debates, and it bothers me that people couldn't see past the simplistic framing and couldn't quite explain it properly either. But this image clarifies the idea. Kirk didn't like to debate people who were experts in debate or professionals in their field. He simply lured people who were unprepared to counter his BS so he could look smart and gain an audience." And yeah, I guess I would agree with that. Charlie Kirk did use a lot of tactics that I would say aren't very forthcoming. But you can see a lot of those tactics on Reddit as well. Average Redditor thinks they're this hotshot debating master, but in reality, they're pretty much all just either bots or NPCs. You can't really tell the difference these days between. I said this to another Redditor recently. I said, you're more bot-like than most bots are, and that's very much how Reddit is at this point. It's increasingly just the same takes, and you're not allowed to disagree with them, because it's like Charlie Kirk might have had the field tilted in his favor at his events, but Reddit definitely has the field tilted in their favor at their event. You can be 100% correct and still be downvoted and have your post or comment removed because the people running the show don't like it, and that's very much, they don't see the irony in that they're the thing they're going after Charlie Kirk for is a thing that they're very much guilty of themselves. And I think you see that a lot in U.S. politics these days. Everyone says, oh, the other side has no standards. Well, their side pretty much has the same lack of standards, but they don't seem to care about that. And that's my thoughts on that issue. The next we have total porn ban proposed by Michigan lawmakers. The bill also includes a section that takes aims at transgender individuals by prohibiting material that includes an individual of one biological sex imitating, depicting, or representing himself or herself to be of the other biological sex. From Fox2Detroit.com, posted by CH4Locks, and that's crosspost from the technology subreddit. And yeah, Reddit's always they're gonna ban porn any day now because, porn, along with censorship and atheism, is one of the core elements of the Reddit religion at this point, I would say. But, personally, I don't think this is too much of a chance of passing, especially because Michigan is a very Democrat-controlled state. But regardless, if the government does want to enforce a porn ban, the government can enforce whatever it wants to. And yeah, I personally think it might be well-intentioned. I think online porn is just too ubiquitous these days, and it's too easy to access, especially for children. But, ultimately, it should be up to the parent or caregivers to keep their kids off of online porn rather than the state. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Glenn. They still have their First Amendment right, though. They're still out here, they're protesting Trump. Well, I'm not so sure. From Dr. 07, and that's crosswords from the law subreddit, and I guess that's a guy from the media talking about Trump. Oh, they still talking to Trump. They stole the First Amendment right, right? And then Trump says, "Oh, I'm not so sure." And this is just Trump jerking himself off. If you want to protest Trump, I personally think that's kind of a shit lib and performative thing to do. But you have every right to, And if Trump wants to go, the First Amendment's bad. He has the ability to. Ultimately, people are going to very much contradict themselves when it comes to freedom of speech, and you definitely see that when it comes to Reddit. They say, "Oh, well, I love freedom of speech." When it's my side, but when it's the out group, it's hate speech, misinformation should be banned. And then it's interesting, they say, that's like it's like that they completely justify Charlie Kirk's murder because even though he just said words, if we're up to average Redditor, probably everyone in the every conservative would be looking like Charlie Kirk currently, and probably everyone who descended from the official DNC narrative at all. I personally more libertarian than conservative, but I'd still probably be permanently censored if Reddit had an option to do that. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.